Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, Ari and Big Mike are proud to present the greatest podcast in the world. No snowflakes allowed, and summer is coming.
That makes 2 in a row. This is not going to be a running joke if you keep getting them right.
Well, the idea is that I would get them right at some point. You know what I mean? Instead of like pre-doing this and making sure we just have the same intro every time, it's like, so I keep trying every time. I got you. I say how it is.
This is going to force me to think up a new running joke, and that's not easy. You're making my life much more difficult than it has to be.
So here's what you need to do. You need to pull out a bottle of bourbon and a shot glass, and every time I say you know, take a shot.
I won't be doing that.
I mean, one of our listeners suggested in the comments, but I have a feeling that in this 15-minute podcast that we do, that somebody will not make it through sober.
I'm a cheap date. There's no way I'd make it through 2 minutes.
All right. Either which way, though, now we've gotten this little banter over. Let me ask you a question there. All right, what do we got for today?
I'm going to take the scenic route to discussing what we are today's topic.
The scenic route.
The scenic route, yeah.
Being very circumspect.
Yeah, I was a criminal defense lawyer for about 10 years. And on the way to jail once, when I was to speak to a client, I went and bought this here book, State of Fear by Michael Crichton. I get to jail. I talk to my client. My client takes a look at the book. Says, I'm in jail. Can you please let me have that book? I'll return it to you.
It's not like he's going anywhere.
Exactly. He's not going anywhere. So, and I'm an old softy, so after a bit more persuading, I let him have my book. A couple weeks later, this very copy of this very book ended up in my mailbox. State of Fear by Michael Crichton. Okay, so I read the book. And in the book, Michael Crichton talks about a disaster that happened in Yellowstone. I think it was Yellowstone. It could have been the other one of the big national parks.
There's a bunch of them.
Yeah.
I mean, let's just be honest.
And what had happened was that when the federal government took over, they wanted there to be more elk because it's a big, beautiful animal, and people would come there and look at these wonderful animals. So what they decided to do was get rid of the wolves. And they got rid of these wolves, and the elk numbers just increased markedly, and it was wonderful for a very short time. And what happened after that was the elk ate all of their normal foliage, and without anything to eat, they started gnawing at the bark of the trees and generally made a huge disaster of the park that they were in. And what happens is that Crichton talks about this, and at the end of the book, he has a list of books that he used as references, because this book is about climate change, and if you're going to, even in fiction, talk about climate change, you're going to want to make sure every little thing is nailed down, and he has put down a bunch of his sources. He gives you all his sources. You can go and find out exactly what he's talking about. And being the obsessive kind of guy that I am, I went through the bibliography of his book and started reading.
Why am I not surprised? I am not surprised at all. Did you go do the same thing with Dan Brown, too?
I never read anything by Dan Brown.
Oh, my God. You got to read Dan Brown. It's like the whole symbology stuff that he goes into. You really need to get into it because his bibliographies are long, and you'd just dive into like a historical, like how we've changed but how we haven't in the same way, like, and when you read some of the stuff that he did there.
As a shameless plug right here, I'm finishing up right now my Kingmaker series, and the last thing I'm doing is putting in, I think it's going to be like 20 pages of bibliography in the finished result plus notes. Now, anyway, in the notes of
Thank
State
you,
of
Mr.
Fear.
Tolkien. Thank you, Mr. Tolkien.
Okay, in the notes of Logic of A State of Fear was this here book, The Logic of Failure by Dietrich Dörner.
Dietrich.
Yes, he was a German psychologist. And he was exploring exactly the kinds of mistakes people tend to make when dealing with complex systems like that national park. He opens his book with a fictitious place in Africa called Tanaland. And in Tanaland, it's this large region of savanna, and half the people there are herders, and they're herding like cattle or sheep or whatever. And the other half of Tanaland are farmers, and they're growing corn or whatever the heck they're growing. And he has people try to develop the area in a computer game. You see, it's a fictitious place that exists only in the computer. And he has people make changes, right? You can increase the number of cattle. You can increase the amount of fertilizer used by the farmers. What happens then? And in most cases, with most people holding the controls, what happens is absolute freaking disaster.
I mean, listen, there was a whole movie called The Lion King, right? Where, like, you see, like, Mustafa is telling Simba about the circle of life, right? Every child has seen this movie at some point, and it's not based on new thoughts either. These are old thoughts. Like, everything goes into everything, and if you don't keep the balance, what happens? Everything gets out of balance, and then, like, for instance, in 1917, when the English got control of Jerusalem and Israel, there were a bunch of rats because of the way the Ottomans kept everything. So to get rid of the rats, they brought in cats. Now, if you go to Jerusalem, there's such a surplus of cats all over the joint that you can't walk anywhere without seeing them, and it's like you can't mess with cycles that are supposed to be there, and when you do, you get out of whack, and the whole system gets hurt because of it.
In India, I think it was, they were offering bounties on cobras. I think I heard this on the Freakonomics podcast. They were offering bounties on cobras, and
alive or dead.
It didn't matter. You bring in a cobra because there are too many of them. You bring in a cobra, they give you money. So what happened was people started breeding cobras in their houses. The law of unintended consequences.
There's a phrase that I once heard attributed to Meyer Lansky.
The gangster.
The gangster, yes. It wasn't just a gangster. He was very pro-Israel and helped finance a lot of the baby state when it first came up in 1948. Helped out with Jews all over the place. He even had a group of thugs. There were a lot of anti-American and pro-German, like Nazi supporters in the United States, and they were doing these rallies in the late 1930s. And the rallies just stopped very quickly. The reason being is because Meyer Lansky and his boys took care of it.
What if my Uncle Jack did that? Not on my father's side.
Well, either which way though, but so he was very much like that, and he just had he had a saying. They said, if man creates a law to forbid something, any crook will figure out a way around it.
Well, you talked about people causing all sorts of disasters in messing with these complicated systems, but there are people who do succeed in managing some of these systems. And who these people are is not always easy to predict. For example, IQ was not very predictive in who was going to be very good at managing these systems. Instead, it was behavior. The people who succeeded among their qualities were they asked a lot of questions to try to, and they asked the right questions to try to figure out how the system they're dealing with worked and how the system would respond to their different interventions.
Well, that requires a level of humility, because one of the things you brought up is like, how much fertilizer does a farmer use? I mean, I've never farmed. I have no idea how to farm. I'd have no idea how much fertilizer. Now, I like history, and I look back and I see, the Mohawk Indians would put chop up pieces of fish. So when they plant it, as the fish was decomposing, that was the fertilizer that they would use. But I have no idea how big the pieces they cut. I have no idea what types. I have no idea about anything. I just know that one basic fact, But the rest of it, I'm completely ignorant of. So of course you got to ask questions if you don't know. Like you go back before about Yellowstone. It's like, what does an elk eat, right? And if we take away the wolves, what would be the intended consequences of it, and will that destroy the ecosystem? Nobody asked those questions. Like, we can know what we can know, but we don't know what we don't know. But the things we know sometimes are enough to say, like, why the hell are we doing this?
So, of course, it's the curiosity, it's the humility, but our last episode, it got me to thinking about something I read in Derner's book, The Logic of Failure. And what he describes is what he calls ballistic behavior. Okay? Ballistic behavior is like, imagine a cannonball. Once you fire that cannonball, the laws of physics have taken over. It goes where it's going to go because of the force that was put onto it, the amount of air pressure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have no influence. A rocket is different. A rocket is not ballistic behavior. You put the rocket up, you can control its trajectory at least to some extent. And when people make decisions, they tend to say, okay, I'm going to increase the number of cattle in tunnel land. I'm going to increase the number of elk in the national park or whatever. And that's their decision, and that's it. They don't bother to ask any further questions. They don't even really look at the results until it's too late. And what Derner says is people look for and find ways to avoid confronting the negative consequences of their actions. And that's what the last podcast we did about welfare in England, about the squalor that was caused by having people live lives where nothing they do is of any consequence. The bureaucrats, the politicians, the media people who promoted all this stuff, they said, we're going to make a war on poverty. And instead of defeating poverty, they got squalor. I think this is a good thought, again, from Derner to conclude this podcast here. It's strange, we think, but an explanation is readily available. Why do people just ignore the consequences of their behavior? If we never look at the consequences of our behavior, we can always maintain the illusion of our competence. We want to feel like we really know what we're doing. If we make a decision to correct a deficiency and then never check on the consequences of that decision, we can believe that the deficiency has been corrected. We can turn to new problems. Ballistic behavior has a great advantage of relieving us all of accountability.
So I'm going to counter that with two thoughts. Thought number one, as an addictions and crisis counselor, I've told this to thousands of clients. There is no failure. What it is that we either learn or we succeed. And when you have that mindset, it doesn't mess with you. Unfortunately, we have the mindset that when we fail, it wrecks our self-esteem and self-worth. So now I bring you to the second thought, and a quote by Winston Churchill: what is success? It's moving from failure to failure without losing motivation. Right? But what is he talking about? What are we really talking about? We're talking about the humility to learn. Like you were talking earlier in the podcast, you got to ask the questions. None of us, nobody here knows everything. I for sure don't. But guess what? We can learn. You were a lawyer. You didn't just automatically, pop out of your mom a lawyer. You went through school. You went through 12 years of schooling like everybody else. Then you went through 4 years of college and 3 years of law school. And you had to study for the bar. And you had to do all this shit just to become a lawyer. We have to learn. But how do you learn is with the understanding that you don't know. And the more you understand that you don't know, the more you're willing to learn how to do it the right way.
You talk about my formal education. I just want to agree with you and mention that I got by in my formal education, passed the bar the first time, but I'd have done so much better if the one thought didn't occur to me, and that thought was this: yeah, I know it. And I thought I knew it until the test came. And when the test came, I was always able to come up with some sort of magic. But darn it, if I hadn't said to myself, gosh, yeah, I know that, the test would have been so much easier.
Right, but like in the past, I've talked to you about Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan knew that he didn't know everything. So what did he do? He learned. Even though he was considered he knew more about outer space in the 20th century than just about anybody else. I mean, I'm sure that, you're in the comments, somebody is telling me, oh, this guy or that guy. But fine, so he's up there. He's already up there as one of the top guys in outer space in the 20th century. And he knew he didn't know everything, so please teach me. If you got something I don't know, we also Armageddon. How, how did we not see this coming? He's like, well, you have this like Hubble telescope. He's like, well, it's a pretty big space and we can only cover maybe 3% of it. It's just like, it's really big. We don't know everything that goes out there. And we don't know. And the more we recognize that we don't know, the more we're able to learn, the more we're able to grow and do. And again, it comes down to humility, and that's really it. So when we're talking about like, let's kill all the wolves, well, how come nobody asked the question, what will that do in the greater scheme of things? And with that, I want to thank you all for listening. Y'all have a good morning, good afternoon, and good night. And, hope the rest of your day is amazing. All the best.
And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.